By the time the referees stepped between them, no one in the room was asking who had won. The European champion was still standing. Bruce Lee had not raised his voice nor his hands in celebration. Yet the match was over, ended not by a strike, but by recognition. Witnesses would later agree on one detail. Nothing dramatic happened in those 90 seconds. No chaos, no showmanship. Only a quiet realization that the contest had already moved beyond competition into something instructional. The referee understood it before anyone else and ended it himself. The ring was not built for spectacle. It sat inside a training hall that had no banners, no seating, and no expectation of applause. The floors showed the dull wear of repeated use, not polish. The ropes were practical, tightened to regulation, checked twice. Nothing about the space suggested performance. It suggested assessment. This was intentional. In 1970, private rings like this existed for one reason: to resolve questions that could not be answered publicly. Titles, reputations, and methods could be demonstrated under lights and cameras, but credibility was tested elsewhere. In rooms like this, outcomes carried no headlines, yet traveled farther than any press clipping. Those present were not casual observers. A referee selected not for celebrity, but for judgment. A small number of coaches and trainers, each with enough experience to remain quiet. No journalists, no promoters. Anyone who expected drama would have found the room disappointing. Bruce Lee arrived without ceremony. No entourage followed him in. No warm-up display announced his readiness. Witnesses would later recall that he seemed more interested in the condition of the floor than in the man he was meant to face. He tested distance with a glance, not a step. He spoke briefly to the referee, not about rules, but about clarity. The room noted this. The absence of ritual unsettled some. Fighters were expected to project intention, to stretch, to move, to mark territory before the first exchange. Lee did none of it. He waited, hands relaxed, posture neutral. It was not indifference, it was economy. The European champion had not yet entered. His delay was procedural, not theatrical. Equipment was checked again, gloves were examined. The referee reviewed stoppage authority with unusual care. In a private ring, responsibility was heavier. There would be no crowd to justify hesitation. The air changed as minutes passed. What unsettled the room was not tension, but quiet, the kind that suggests a conclusion forming before an action begins. A few witnesses would later say they felt as though something had already been decided, not by agreement, but by alignment, as if one presence in the room was adjusting to the environment, while the environment waited for the other to catch up. When the door finally opened again, footsteps approached. Bruce Lee did not turn immediately. He remained where he was, facing the center of the ring, as if the opponent were already there. The European champion entered with the composure of someone accustomed to recognition. His movements were efficient, practiced in front of judges and crowds who understood what his title represented. Years of sanctioned bouts had trained him not only to fight, but to arrive correctly, to acknowledge the room, to measure his opponent with open confidence. He was not disrespectful, he was precise. The belt itself was not present, but its influence was. Titles, even when unseen, shape posture. They add structure to certainty. The champion carried himself as someone whose methods had been verified repeatedly under formal rules. His stance reflected a system, tested combinations, orthodox spacing, predictable responses refined through repetition. He noticed Bruce Lee immediately. What registered first was not threat, but difference. Lee did not mirror him. There was no reciprocal sizing up, no shift into a familiar guard. The champion adjusted slightly, as fighters do when an opponent refuses to settle into recognizable patterns. It was a minor correction, almost subconscious. The referee brought them together. Rules were reviewed briefly. This was not a bout for points, nor a demonstration for students. Stoppage authority was absolute. Either man could withdraw, but neither suggested it. The champion nodded, confident in the clarity of engagement. Lee listened without expression, acknowledging only what was necessary. When they separated, the distance between them felt deliberate. Witnesses would later say that the champion appeared larger in that moment, not physically, but institutionally. He represented something established, a lineage, a system validated by committees and borders. Bruce Lee represented no such structure. He had no title to present, no organization to invoke. And yet, the imbalance did not favor the champion. Lee's stance was neither formal nor casual. It was adaptable, uncommitted. He was not waiting to impose himself. He was waiting to receive information. The champion, by contrast, was ready to demonstrate correctness. This difference mattered. As the referee stepped back, a subtle shift occurred. The champion leaned into expectation, anticipating exchange, resistance, escalation. Lee did not meet him there. He remained centered, almost withdrawn, as if the contest were already underway somewhere else. For a brief moment before the first movement, the room held two forms of authority. Only one of them was flexible. The opening seconds passed without engagement, no feints, no probing strikes, just distance. The European champion advanced carefully, applying the measured pressure expected of someone trained to control space. His footwork was correct, his guard disciplined. To an outside observer, this would have looked like patience. To those in the room, it felt like assumption, the belief that the rhythm of the encounter would eventually reveal itself. It did not. Bruce Lee did not retreat, but he did not advance either. He adjusted in increments too small to categorize. His feet shifted not to escape, but to remain aligned. Each movement answered a question before it was fully asked. The champion paused, then stepped again, testing timing. The room began to change. Silence in a fight can become pressure. Without exchanges to release tension, attention sharpens. Coaches leaned forward without realizing it. The referee narrowed his focus, watching not for contact, but for imbalance. Lee's eyes never fixed, they tracked. What unsettled the champion was not threat, but absence, the absence of cues. There was no exaggerated breathing, no commitment to a lead side, no telegraphed intention. Every system depends on predictability to function, even at its highest levels. Lee offered none. The champion attempted to impose structure, circling to draw a response, adjusting angle to force engagement. Each time, Lee was already there, not intercepting, not countering, simply occupying the space that denied advantage. This was not dominance in the visible sense. It was containment. A faint shift in posture betrayed the first internal recalculation. The champion tightened his guard slightly. His steps shortened. These were not mistakes, but they were concessions, small acknowledgments that something familiar was missing. Observers later struggled to describe this phase because nothing happened. That was precisely the point. Pressure does not always announce itself through action. Sometimes it arrives through the denial of expectation. The champion was prepared to exchange techniques. He was not prepared to be studied without reciprocity. The referee noticed the change before the others. His attention moved from hands to feet, from strikes to balance. He saw moments where intervention could have occurred, not violently, but conclusively. Moments that passed unused, not out of hesitation, but out of choice. The realization settled slowly. This was not a contest of endurance or power. It was an examination of control. And one participant was being examined without knowing when the test had begun. When the first decisive movement finally came, it did not feel like escalation. It felt like confirmation. The shift was so contained that some witnesses missed its beginning. There was no sudden charge, no audible cue to mark the change. Bruce Lee closed distance not by advancing,
But by arriving, his body aligning into a position the champion had already surrendered without noticing. The first contact was brief, purposeful. It did not resemble a strike as much as a correction. The champion reacted instinctively, attempting to reassert spacing. His response was technically sound, drawn from years of repetition, but the exchange ended before it could develop. Lee was no longer where the counter expected him to be. He had already moved to the space that followed. What occurred next unfolded in fragments rather than sequences. A redirection of balance, a momentary compromise of stance, a step taken too late to recover structure. Each action by Lee removed an option, not violently, efficiently. The champion was not overwhelmed, he was reduced. His available responses narrowed with each adjustment until his training offered no immediate answer. The room felt it before it understood it. This was not speed in the theatrical sense, it was timing stripped of excess. Lee did not pursue advantage, he accepted it as it appeared, then let it go. Where another fighter might have pressed, he disengaged, only to re-enter from a position of greater leverage. The referee's role changed during these moments. He stopped watching for fouls or damage. He began watching for inevitability. Private bouts end not when someone falls, but when continuation ceases to serve a purpose. The referee saw openings that, if taken, would have ended the encounter abruptly. He also saw that Lee was choosing not to take them. That restraint carried its own message.
The European champion was still upright, still capable, but his posture no longer projected certainty. His breathing had altered, not from exhaustion, but from recalibration. He was trying to understand what had already happened. 90 seconds had passed. In that span, no decisive blow had landed. No crowd would have gasped. Yet the referee stepped forward. His hand rose, not in alarm, but in recognition. He understood that the balance of authority in the ring had shifted beyond reversal. He ended it there, not as a verdict of defeat, but as an acknowledgement that the demonstration was complete. The stoppage created no immediate reaction. There was no protest, no raised voices, no confusion that demanded explanation. For a brief moment, both men remained where they were, as if waiting for the room to catch up. The European champion looked first to the referee, then back to Bruce Lee. His expression was controlled but altered. This was not the look of someone who had been beaten. It was the look of someone who had encountered a limit he had not previously mapped. Bruce Lee offered nothing in response. He did not nod, he did not gesture, he simply stepped back, resetting his stance as though the exercise had paused rather than ended. In that movement, observers noticed something subtle. His breathing had not changed, his posture had not shifted. Whatever effort had been required, it had already been absorbed and released. The referee spoke quietly. No declaration was made, no outcome recorded. In a private ring, such formalities were unnecessary. The conclusion was understood by those qualified to understand it. The champion removed his gloves without haste. He did not look away, but neither did he attempt to reframe the moment. Titles protect reputation, but they cannot insulate perception. Something had occurred that did not diminish his standing publicly, yet had altered it internally. This distinction mattered. Witnesses would later say that the room felt emptied, though no one had left. The tension that had gathered through restraint dissipated all at once, replaced by something closer to clarity. The encounter had not answered a question of superiority. It had answered a question of method. Bruce Lee gathered his belongings in silence. No one approached him immediately, not out of reverence, but because there was nothing to ask. Explanation would have cheapened the demonstration. Whatever had been shown was meant to be observed, not discussed. The champion lingered for a moment longer. He spoke briefly with his coach, words too low to carry. There was no visible frustration, only reconsideration. When both men eventually exited the room, they did so separately. No acknowledgement passed between them beyond what had already been exchanged in the ring. The ending had not been declared. It had been understood. The ring was dismantled within days. The hall returned to routine use, its brief role in something uncommon left unmarked. There were no photographs circulated, no official record filed. To the outside world, nothing had occurred. Yet the story did not disappear. It moved quietly, carried by those who had been present and those they trusted enough to tell. Not as a boast, not as an anecdote sharpened for effect. The details remained unusually consistent over time, precisely because there was little spectacle to distort them. 90 seconds. A referee's decision. No knockout. No humiliation. What endured was not the action, but the restraint. Among coaches and fighters, the incident became a reference point. It surfaced in conversations about control, about the difference between proving something and demonstrating it. When spoken of, Bruce Lee's name was mentioned without embellishment. The emphasis was placed elsewhere, on what had not been done. Years later, some who heard the account initially dismissed it. They expected escalation, drama, visible dominance. Those who had been there would respond with a pause, then a clarification. That expectation was exactly what the moment dismantled. The European champion continued his career. His title remained intact. Publicly, nothing had changed. Privately, his training shifted. Those close to him noticed adjustments, less rigidity, more attention to timing and space. He did not credit the encounter directly. He did not need to. Bruce Lee, for his part, never referenced the incident in interviews. He left no recorded commentary, no explanation to frame it for history. His teachings would later echo the same principles shown in that room, but never anchored to that day. The absence of attribution preserved the lesson. Over time, the story lost its specifics and gained weight. It was no longer about a European champion or a private ring in 1970. It became a quiet example used to illustrate an idea that mastery reveals itself most clearly when it has nothing to prove. Those who repeated it did so carefully. They understood that the power of the incident lay in its understatement. To exaggerate it would have been to misunderstand it. In the end, the moment endured not because of who stopped the fight, but because of who did not need to finish it. And that is how it entered legend. Not loudly, not officially, but intact.